Good evening, everyone. My name is Napoleon Larison, and I'm the co-chair of the Brandeis Alumni of Color Network. And I would like to welcome you all to a discussion this evening with Professor Ibrahim Sundiata. He's an American scholar of West African and African American history, and is Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor Emeritus of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. First of all, we'd like to appreciate and thank you all as alums, fellow alumni board members, board of trustees, faculty and staff, current students, parents of current students and former students, new friends in the Brandeis National Committee and members of the Bali community. First of all, I would like to introduce Lewis Brooks, who is the president of the Alumni Board Association.
Thank you, Napoleon. As Napoleon said, I'm Lewis Brooks, class of '80, president of the Alumni Association. And I wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the Alumni of Color Network at Brandeis. The Alumni of Color Network Shared Interest Group is a self-selecting, opt-in community intended to serve as an affinity space for individuals from historically marginalized racial and ethnic groups, as well as their allies. Given legacies of exclusion through policies and practices based on race and ethnicity in our society, the AOC network aims to address the needs of an established community among Brandeis's graduates of color and their alumni allies. By providing opportunities for alumni connections and mentorship to current students, the AOC network supports the goals of the university and our collective efforts to move towards a more equitable and just society. Napoleon, back to you.
Yeah, before I introduce Professor Sundiata, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. To ensure that we can hear the speakers clearly, everyone is muted on this call. So if you have any questions for the speaker, just please use the chat feature to enter them, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Another housekeeping item, please hit the speaker view button to see the speakers on this session. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Ibrahim Sundiata. I have had the honor of having him as my professor at Brandeis when I was a student. He received his doctorate from Northwestern University, where he was active in the 1968 Black student protest that demanded a structural anti-racist change in the university. Professor Sundiata's initial research was on West Africa in the era of the slave trade. He has taught African history at Rutgers University, Northwestern, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and at Brandeis he served as the chair of the Department of African and Afro-American Studies. He also had the honor of serving as the chair of the History Department at Howard University. After leaving Howard, he was the fellow at the Du Bois Institute of Harvard University. He's the author of 4 books. His last work is on the Garvey movement and the argument of pro and con for the African American returning to Africa, Brothers and Stranger, Black Zion, Black Slavery. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sundiata.
Okay. Napoleon, thank you so much. I want to thank you and the Alumni of Color. I also want to thank Courtney Sunkar for helping organize this. And it is a pleasure to meet also Lewis Brooks for the first time. I haven't been back to Brandeis in a while. And this is just not housekeeping, but before this evening, I was on another webinar, which was a training webinar, and I failed. It went on very, very long, and it was for older people, but it's for something that's happening in a month. And we were supposed to learn how to do fancy things with background, make background dance and all that. And I decided that rather than be late coming here, obviously, that I would step out early. So I'm playing hooky from that because this is a true commitment. I am an Africanist, which means I study Africa. And in my day, Africa and African-American things were quite separate at major American institutions. That's no longer true, and I think that's a good thing. But when I was doing graduate work, there was African studies. I went to Northwestern, which supposedly had the best African studies. in the United States, and it was founded by a man called Melville Herskovitz. There were, I think, besides myself, there were no African-American students. All the other students were African, and there was no African-American history. It was part of Southern history. Now, all of that in the last several decades, more than that, in my academic lifetime has changed, all to the better. When I approached the Garvey movement, which was about 17 years ago, I approached it as an Africanist. And I thought, there are a lot of books about Marcus Garvey, lots. And they usually concentrate on one place, which is no more than 40 blocks by 40 blocks. They concentrate on Harlem in New York. That was his base, that was his headquarters. And he raises questions. I spoke to a young woman with the Brandeis Connection recently, and she said, "Oh, you're going to talk about that man. Wasn't he a crook?" And I said, "Well, not exactly. He was not a crook. He died in great poverty and relative obscurity. At the same time, he had ideas which, some of them which would be quite shocking today. I mean, he had some ideas about color, some ideas about allyship. My interest was he realistic? Because what he planned was that eventually a portion of the African-American population should go to the country that was planned for them. And this country was Liberia. James Madison had been in favor of freeing African Americans and sending them to Liberia. Thomas Jefferson had been in favor of freeing African Americans if they went to Liberia. Abraham Lincoln was in favor of freeing African Americans if they went to Liberia. Ulysses Grant was in favor of sending African Americans either to Santo Domingo, Haiti, or Liberia, right? So it's an old idea. So Garvey was an immigrant. He was a person from the northern shore of Jamaica. He was of middling family. His family knew how to read and write. His father had he was a skilled laborer in St. Anne's Parish. Garvey became a printer, went to Kingston, became a printer, then was involved in a strike, and then went to work as a kind of bookkeeper for United Fruit in Central America, Costa Rica, Nicaragua. And then went to Panama, where he published his own, because he was a printer, published a newspaper called The Nation, or La Nación. It's a bilingual paper. And went back to Jamaica, decided Jamaica was too small, and then went to England, where he heard a lot of speeches about anti-colonialism, the rights of small nations, the equality of all peoples, plural. In 1916, he decided to meet his idol. And so he bought a ticket. He went to Jamaica, then he bought a ticket to meet his idol, the man who was the most important Black person in the world, the most famous Black person in the world, the Black person with most accolades, the Black person who was going to lead African Americans into the 20th century. And when he arrived to meet this man, the man was dead. This man was Booker T. Washington. And so young Garvey was born in 1887. Right? So Garvey is fairly young, and he goes to Alabama to meet his hero, but his hero is dead because he's still very much into uplift. You know, if you play by the rules, if you save your money, if you open a store, if you have a cooperative, there's a chance. Then after not meeting Booker T. Washington, he went on a tour of the United States. And then he settled in Harlem. So he's settling in Harlem around 1917 as this short, dark person, an immigrant with an accent. By 1920, he had the largest African-American organization ever. Now, that's quite something. And he's an autodidact, you know. You all went to Brandeis, you know what that is. I mean, you're not autodidact. See, he was self-taught. He also gave himself titles, by the way. He'd gone to night school in England, and he said, well, you know, I've got titles too. And his idea was that businesses should be built up, and then there should be immigration to Liberia. And when this happened, those who wanted to go, those people who wanted to go, those people who were capable of going, those people who were purely African. He was very much insisting that he wanted pure Africans to go to this homeland that had been prepared for them in the 1820s. So this was not a new thing. Liberia was founded in 1822. It was 98 years old. Now, why didn't this happen? Well, first, he lacked capital. He bought ships. He bought 3 ships. He was gypped on the ships. One was a riverboat stern wheeler. It couldn't go, it could barely get up the Hudson River. He bought another ship, which was an old tramp steamer, which he then sent on a tour to the Caribbean, and it got a contract to bring back bananas. But as it was traveling back to the United States, he ordered it to stop in Florida, in Jacksonville, so Black people could come and see the ship that they had bought. And it was very successful as propaganda. Banana spoiled, and he was sued. He had another ship, again, which he bought. It was overpriced, which blew a boiler, and none of these ships could take him to Africa. He called his shipping line the Black Star Line. The reason was there was a White Star Line. The White Star Line had a ship, you may not know it, it had a ship called the Titanic, which had a bad end. So if the Whites have the White Star Line, we'll have the Black Star Line. But he couldn't get capital. He collected money and collected money. His enemies, and he had many enemies. He was dictatorial. He said that when the state was set up, there would be a president for life. Now, he was contradictory because he never really had a program about how this was to work. There'd be a president for life, and the president for life could be removed and executed for crimes. But it wasn't explained how this was to happen. There would be capitalism. He was very anti-socialist, so he said he wanted to see a Black Rockefeller. He wanted to see a Black Ford. He wanted to see Black people make lots of money. They couldn't do that in the United States. So he sent 4 missions to Liberia, 4 missions. The first in 1920, the next one in 1921, the next one in 1923, and the last one in 1924. And he sent these missions to talk to the Liberian government. There was a Liberian government, and this Liberian government initially said, this is most interesting. I mean, he never, by the way, I said I had to call out a man called Ibram Kendi, who has a new book, who says, well, you know, Liberia, both Garvey and Du Bois went to Africa. Garvey never went to Africa, and that's part of the tale. He sent people there, and the President King of Liberia said, it's wonderful, it's a dream. Send money first. And so with nickels and dimes, et cetera, Garvey planned to send people. At the meeting in August of 1920, he had the mayor of Monrovia, Mayor Johnson, come to New York. And he said, well, you are the supreme potentate of this new state. Garvey, who had a big ego, said, I'm provisional president of Africa, of all of Africa. But you are the potentate of Monrovia. The problem was, what did this do with the president of Liberia? What did this do with the people already in place? So he sent another man. He sent someone in 1920, he sent someone in 1921. And that is probably, this is why I like the African part of the story. I'm not an American, so I don't deal with the Harlem part of the story. Why did it fail? This man, part of a team, a 4-man team, his name was Eli Garcia, and he was from a place called Haiti. And Garcia looked at the Liberian situation and said, my God, it's horrible. It is horrible. There is the abuse of native women. Officials live with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes as young as 10. The missionaries sit silent and fat. There is an impressment of children to carry heavy loads, but more than that, there's impressment of men to build roads to nowhere, because there were no surveyors. So there are all these roads that the government is building with unfree labor. And if people objected, they were beaten, branded, etc. Garcia said, this to me resembles something we used to call back on the other side of the ocean, slavery. But we must keep our mouths shut for the time being, since the government, having no other means of support besides charging the users of labor for the labor, will get very upset. Now, Garcia made a big mistake. First, he was honest, and that was, I'm not saying that's, ethically, that's fine. I mean, that's great, be honest. But he was sort of stupid, because he sent this missive to Garvey, the head of the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. He sent this by post to Garvey in New York. It was read by the Liberian government. The Liberian government was not happy, but they didn't immediately cut off Garvey and Garveyism. Garvey sent 2 more missions. He sent one in early 1923, and they were welcomed, they were driven around, and they were told, well, you know, you can come, but property can only be owned by Liberians. If you have ships, they have to be registered in Liberia. If you own land, you have to have a Liberian owner. You just can't come here and own things. So you bring your money and we'll invest it for you. This made the delegation a bit upset, as you can imagine. They said, well, and they're Pan-African. We're all black, we're all brothers. And then the Liberian government says, President King, who's on the front of the book, he's an interesting character. This is President C.D.B. King, Charles Burgess Dunbar King. He was president. And President King said, well, if you're going to bring money and invest in our country, you have to do it as Liberians. And Garvey said, well, we're all black, and, you know, can we? And then King says, well, you can't have settlements together. You want to all settle in one little New Harlem. You can't do that. You have to be scattered among other Liberians. That didn't work out very well. Garvey wasn't happy. And then in 1924, in May of 1924, another mission was sent, the final mission. And people say, well, Garvey was a dreamer, he didn't plan anything. Garvey was very different from the Nation of Islam. He was very different from a lot of black movements. He believed in cement, tractors, quinine. He believed in all of these good things, airplanes. He believed in all of this, and that with modern technology, it would be possible to settle Liberia with some African Americans, right? So he sends over tractors, cements, et cetera. They arrive. The group is then taken. They meet the president. They make an emotional appeal about lynching, castration. I mean, it's very emotional. One of the people is a woman. She's an actress. They appeal from the heart about what life is like in Dixie and how this is the only place in the world where this minority can be free. She and her cohorts are put on a boat for Liverpool. They're deported. And the Liberian government kept the cement and the tractors and the other building materials and sold them. And that was the end of the Garvey plan in Liberia on the ground. He never went. There was a great deal of disenchantment with him. He was very disenchanted with the Liberians. And also, he believed that he had an enemy. that he had a mortal enemy. He had several mortal enemies. He had the FBI, he had the State Department, he had colonial governments, the French government and the British government. But he said, besides, he had black socialists like A. Philip Randolph, who was a socialist that he disagreed with violently. But he said his greatest enemy was from Massachusetts, a man puffed up with the wrong ideas. And I'm going to say, this is not me talking, I'm quoting. So when I do that, it means quote. Right? I tell my students, history is sometimes rough and the language used is rough. He said, the product of a bastard aristocracy. He said that in the United States, for various reasons, certain people had risen to the top without doing very much, and that they wanted to lead the masses, but the masses were with him, he said. And so this man I'm talking about was W.E.B. Du Bois, PhD from Harvard, I think another PhD from Berlin, sociologist, historian, you name it. And one of the founders in 1909 of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Garvey took issue with that as well. Garvey said, well, you know, where I come from, colored people mean mixed. That was the law in Jamaica. That's why he called this organization the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Wherever you were, if you were black, you could become a member. So he said various things about Du Bois. Du Bois retaliated. It was not all at once. It was over a period of time where they actually met once, but it was not a good meeting. They never met again. Du Bois felt that he was a kind of West Indian immigrant agitator, but that basically harmless. He speaks to those people from the West Indies up there in Harlem. You know, he dismissed him at the beginning. By 1923, he was very afraid of Garvey. Garvey, remember, by this point, Garvey had the biggest movement around. It was much bigger than the NAACP. And the NAACP was a mixed organization. The executive director was always an African-American, and the president was always a Jew. So Garvey keeps saying, well, you know, I'm here for a black movement. And Du Bois then scooped Garvey, and this is really where the African part comes in. In 1923, Du Bois was invited to a conference in Lisbon about Portuguese colonialism, Pan-Africanism. He liked the trip. He felt a kinship with the Portuguese. Portuguese imperialism was not as bad as other imperialisms. And he went there to Lisbon. And while he was in Lisbon, he heard that he could go to the second inauguration of President King. And he would be given the title of Minister Plenipotentiary. That's impressive. Minister Plenipotentiary. Minister to the inauguration. And he was given a letter by Calvin Coolidge. The Republicans said, well, you know, he used to be radical, but he's controllable. When you read the letter, it's funny, you know. We can send him as long as he pays for himself. He's got to get from Lisbon to Monrovia, the capital of Liberia, pay his own way. So he goes with this huge proclamation to give to the President King. He goes, and he is so impressed. And I was going to read it to you, but yeah, quite read. One of the things he was impressed with is class. He says, there I was at a plantation on the St. Paul's River. The water wafted past. The laughter of children greeted me. There I was in a house of 4 generations as the master took his ease among an endless supply of native servants. He didn't see the contradiction. You know, black people were on top. And so he denied it later that he spoke. He said, I didn't speak to the Liberians about Garvey, but while he's still there, the Garveyites arrived. David Levin Lewis has written a biography, huge multi-volume biography of Du Bois says, no, Du Bois obviously spoke to them and said these people are crazy, they want to take over your country. And upshot was Garvey didn't go. Garvey was accused of mail fraud in 1923. The case dragged on. Garvey Garvey had a great ego, and he decided to conduct his own defense, which is a mistake. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover was out to get him. They convicted him on the basis of an envelope with nothing in it, just the name of the company, the steamship company, and an address, right? And they convicted him, and he said, this is ridiculous. But he conducted his own defense, and then he did something horrible. He did something stupid. He insulted the judge. Insulted the judge in a way that did him no good. Judge Mack, Julian Mack. And he said to Judge Mack, I know why you dislike me, because you're a member of the NAACP. And you should recuse yourself because you are a member of the organization which is my enemy. And besides that, Judge Mack, you are a Jew. And you people, and this is not going to win you your case. You people control the NAACP, and you wish to crush me. Well, guess what? He got the maximum sentence. It didn't do him any good. He was sent to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He was sent to Deep Dixie. He stayed there 2 years until 1927, when President Calvin Coolidge pardoned him. It was felt that many people, the conviction on the envelope was a bit shaky. There were people who said, well, you know, he's a loudmouth, he's a rabble-rouser, but this is too much. I mean, besides, life for a Black prisoner in Atlanta in the mid-1920s was horrible. His job was cleaning latrines, and this was partly to break him. You clean the latrines. You think you're somebody, you think you're provisional president of Africa, get down and clean the latrines. So finally, one Republican, Coolidge, says, okay, I will commute his sentence. He may leave prison, but he is deported. And he was deported from Atlanta to New Orleans, not allowed to see his wife at all in New York, not allowed to collect his belongings, put on a boat. Thousands of Black people came to the boat crying. They were kept away by police, put on a banana boat, and sent to Kingston. Now, the rest of his life was lived sort of in retrospect, because most people talk about the glory of Garveyism. We're talking about the 1920s, right? So he goes home, he's elected to the city council, but then he couldn't stop. I mean, I don't think he was a con man, because I don't think he was that smooth. And what I mean is, he's elected to the city council, then he wants to be elected to the legislative council, but he accuses judges of being corrupt. And he gets put in prison in Jamaica for sedition. I'm thinking, couldn't he just be quiet for once? So what happens is he goes to this very small island, he gets involved in island politics, he has a following, but he's not able to transfer that into any kind of major political movement. He's always accusing his enemies of being corrupt. He's always speaking in ways that are very inflammatory. So in the mid-1930s, 1935, he left Jamaica forever and went to England and became a shadow of himself. He spoke at Hyde Park Corner. In other words, he became a street corner speaker. You know, so I used to be somebody. Millions listened to me. He also became a very strange pro-Zionist, world's strangest pro-Zionist. He said, you know, I support a Jewish state in Palestine because any minority that's a permanent minority is at danger. And he says that man, he doesn't say his name, this particular article I'm remembering, that man means the world no good. He means them no good. And what do you think he means for us? Meaning, you know, what does Hitler mean for black people? This is like 1937, 38. So that there should be, he's all over the place. There should be an Irish Free State. There should be a free India. There should be a Jewish Palestine. And then broken, he had asthma, he was overweight, he had no job. He had a new newspaper called The Black Man with a very small circulation in London. But he had one final moment of hope. It was one, he's in his 50s, he's not old. He doesn't live to be old. But there was one final hope. And that hope was a man called Bilbo, Senator Theodore Bilbo, of the great state of Mississippi. And Bilbo, for his own reasons, said, you know, I think you're right. I'm going to introduce a bill in the Senate so that you can all go back to Liberia and you won't be on relief. Relief is an old-fashioned term for welfare. You know, so instead of welfare, instead of getting any part of Social Security, all that, you know, we will take that money and send you to Liberia. And I don't think Bilbo was that serious. It was more or less, he didn't like the NACP, he didn't like integration, and so here he had a group of people. Garvey went to Toronto because he couldn't come to the United States, and there was another meeting. He didn't meet with Bilbo, but Bilbo says, I hear you, I support you. And then he said in a funny way, if she loves blacks so much, Eleanor Roosevelt can be queen of Greater Ethiopia, Greater Liberia. So he plays with it. Garvey says, I don't care how much I don't care what his motives are. If we can get a bill in the Senate and we can get some money to go, I accept it. I don't care if this man doesn't like us. I don't like him, but he's honest. He always said white racists were the only honest white people. The bill stalled. It didn't go through. It was it was still in the Senate in 1946, and then Bilbo, as my mother said, God took Bilbo out of here. He had a stroke. Garvey lived on 2 more years. That's 1938, 1940, predicting a kind of race war, predicting capitalism, saying that Hitler was going to unleash upon the world a great violence, which would affect Jews, but then other peoples too. By the way, some of you have heard of Lev Jabotinsky, who was a Jew, was a sort of right of center Zionist. And he actually said, you know, Garvey was onto something. There are no happy minorities. Get out of there. Anyway, Garvey had asthma, various other diseases, died at 52, almost 53, in a room in London, more or less alone. And his enemies in the United States, one of the black papers in Chicago, published his obituary before he died. And he read it. And that was like the final humiliation. He died forgotten in the Blitz. He died as the Germans were bombing London. He died semi-forgotten. If you read books from the 1940s, because there are a few books in the 1940s that mention him. Oh, the guy 20 years ago, the guy with the funny uniforms, the guy with the funny salutes, the guy who got all those West Indians out there in the street. Yeah, him. In the 1960s, though, he's rediscovered by young black writers as a black nationalist. And because he said, there should be no great difference between African Americans and African or Caribbean immigrants. That's just the way of dividing us. And so when I was in school, Garvey, there was a Garvey boom. There were like 7 books on Garvey. We read about Garvey in class. Of course, Garvey was dead and in his grave. And his plan, there were no books really looking at Liberia, what was going on in Liberia. And in Liberia, there really was no chance of him having success. Now, before I shut up, I don't know, do I have any more time?
Yeah,
Well,
a few more minutes, and then we can get
a few more
Q&A.
minutes. Okay, well, this is something completely not in the book, and this is completely me. Garvey, in an alternative universe, could have succeeded. But it would have been a very different Garvey. It would have been a less racially aggressive Garvey. It would have been a Garvey who knew how to work the levers of white power, approach white philanthropy, wrap it in a kind of Christian coding, like I could call it the International Rescue Committee or something like that. Send teams from Tuskegee to find out what Black people could raise in Liberia. Because Firestone Rubber of Akron went in, got over 1 million acres at 6 cents an acre for 99 years. That's a lot. And then Du Bois is saying, that's wonderful. Now you must employ the Black graduates of universities. And Harvey Firestone says, oh, no. Harvey Firestone creates a little America, you know, with a clubhouse, golf course, swimming pool. It's quite possible to live very well in the tropics. Garvey was right. I mean, this whole thing about everyone going and getting malaria and dying, no. But the Firestone Rubber was not going to hire American Blacks. It felt they were uppity, that they had a race problem, and they wanted too much money. Because Firestone went in Liberia because they paid Africans less than they paid Asians in Malaysia and Indonesia. And that was almost nothing. The British and the Dutch control most of the world's rubber. And Firestone said, we'll underbid them. We'll get an African population we can pay much below. So if Garvey was going to win, he would have had to have a product that the world wanted. It wouldn't be rubber. Most people weren't going to leave the United States, Kentucky, Alabama, New Jersey, and climb up and tap rubber trees. So today, not today, but the last week I've been thinking, what could they have done if it were they could have sent an exploratory group and raised something that families can raise and make an income. A crop that doesn't need gang labor, a crop that grows in Liberia, a crop that demands time to grow. You need 7 years. But one of the main crops in neighboring Cote d'Ivoire and neighboring Gold Coast, now gone, is cocoa. It's the cocoa region. It's what we call a peasant crop. It wasn't grown on plantation, it was grown by Africans near their homes. In 1814 already, Gold Coast, Ghana, is the world's largest producer of chocolate. Because people need to be, they don't just sit there and you know, eat coconuts. I mean, it's a bad climate. But it wasn't planned very well. Du Bois thought that this company, headed by Harvey Firestone, who was a true racist, his papers are still sealed, by the way. Apparently they contain some interesting words about a certain group of people. They're locked up. I've never seen them. No one has ever seen them. I know that a certain N-word is there frequently. So he wasn't going to hire people even like Du Bois. And he wanted raw Africans, as he called them, who would work for almost nothing. And on that, I will end. I didn't mention the second part of the book. I only mentioned the first part of the book. So you can ask me about the second part of the book, but I stop for questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Sundiata. And this is a statement that says, like, we in Virginia are told that Garvey purchased some property of the Small Institute in Claremont, Virginia. It was located on the James River, virtually directly across from Jamestown. We're also told that he was docked on one of his ships at Claremont. Apparently, this was just before the federal securities fraud. Do you know any like his connection to Virginia?
No, I never heard that he owned land in Virginia. I mean, his ships were the Phyllis Wheatley and the Kanawha and the Frederick Douglass. Now he could, I mean, he wanted to buy property in the US, but only to make money so he could go abroad. First time I'm hearing that. That's good. I'll look it up. I will. Because
Yeah,
he wasn't against owning property in the US, but that was to accumulate enough capital to get out of the US.
and feel free to our guest here. Feel free to raise your hand. You can unmute yourself to get to ask Professor Sundiata a question. The next question here is like the British and the French were upset by Garvey's anti-colonial message. Was he a well-known figure in Africa outside of Liberia?
Yes, he was. And there are books about that. His Negro World was read up and down the African coast. It was read by literate people to illiterate people. And in 1922 in South Africa, there was a revolt against the South African government in the countryside. And one of the ideas was that Americans were coming in airplanes to save the Black people. Now this was, you know, someone had had a copy, maybe in Cape Town, of the newspaper, and then it had, by word of mouth, the story had sort of spread. But sailors had the newspaper. The newspaper was often banned. I was in Australia. I was in Melbourne, in a museum, an Indigenous museum, and saw a man who was quite pale, so looks European, more or less. And we were talking, and he said, "Wait a minute, sir, I'm as Black as you." And I thought, "Oh, no, you're not." But he meant he was partially Aborigine. And he said, "My grandfather was head of the UNIA in Melbourne, in Australia." So in the main ports of Europe, and most of the ports of Africa, and in the interior of South Africa, and to a certain extent in the West Indies, there were barbarians. Yeah. So it spread briefly throughout the world with this great idea of hope, until, of course, he went to prison.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And the British and the French, the British controlled Guinea, which is on the border of Liberia, and the British controlled Sierra Leone. And so there was this fear, since he was saying Africa for the Africans, that one, if he ever took over Liberia, then the two adjoining colonies would somehow be taken over by the Garveyites. White people are fine in Europe, but Africa is ours.
What is one main element of Garvey's life that you hope future generations will remember about him? And what insights from his experiences can we apply to the current movement for Black lives?
Yeah, I think it was the fact that he believed that the base, sort of ordinary Black people, would determine their destinies. He was not a socialist, but he had this big thing about regular people, not people who are inventing theories within, let's say universities, think tanks. I mean, there were some, but that if people organized against abuse, they could change the system. At the same time, and this is why he's prescient, maybe, he sort of said, but to complain as a permanently excluded group, it's never going to change. So his thing was, find an escape. Some of us will escape, others will get business, but the solution must always come from the base. It must come from the washerwoman. It must come from the Pullman porter. It will not come from the people going to certain universities. Okay? And I think that we have to look at that today. I mean, there are a lot of people I know who have lovely ideas, which I hear from my Brandeis colleagues, and I go, this is wonderful. But that these ideas are so reified that they really don't apply to people's lived experience. And so, for instance, Latinx. I've been writing about this for years. I live in Latin America a lot. I lived in Latin America. And in the United States, less than 3% of the people use the term. Now, if you're going to try to organize people to do something, you have to meet them where they are. What do they call themselves? What do they feel about themselves? And Garvey was very good about that. Garvey was very good about listening to people. You know, what does the average washerwoman want? What does the average Pullman porter want? And I think his ability to translate mass discontent into a movement is something we could learn from today. Also, he eschewed violence. He wasn't a very violent man because he said in a race war, they're going to win. We want out of here. I mean, that was his, you know, we want out of here. We will demonstrate against lynching, et cetera, but we also want to connect that getting out of it. And I'll tell you the worst thing he did, but someone else can ask me the worst thing he did.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself. This opportunity to engage Professor Sundiata.
The worst thing he did was embrace the Ku Klux Klan, which he did in 1924. He was very angry at being sentenced by Judge Mackin on the people. He was very angry at the NAACP. He said, well, you know, all this, you know, the shifts and other people gave me all this money to the other side. I can get money too. Well, where are you going to get money? Well, the Klan. And he actually met with the leader of the Klan, and not very smart. There was a photo. And he said, well, you don't want us here and we don't want to be here. And the head of the Klan said, you're right, we don't want you here. But if you want to go someplace else, good. And that was a big mistake. Many people broke with him. We're with you on, you know, that is too much. That is meeting the devil himself. The cause of lynching and burnings and all this. Yeah. I mean, we realize they want us out, but don't meet with them. Okay.
Someone asked, like, what is that worst thing?
That was the worst thing. I think that's the worst thing.
We got one more question here. Go ahead.
Napoleon. Oh, hi, Professor. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. I put in the chat that my mom, Olubanki King Akerele, she is class of 67. She's the granddaughter of President King. And I'm very pleased to be a part of this. One of her best friends in life, Alisa Hill, also a graduate, is on the call tonight. So I wanted to acknowledge that. One of the questions I have, we have had the privilege of having the family side history of what you have written and researched. And so there are lots of points that we grew up understanding. I won't bring them up, but the one point I have is, why did he not visit Liberia, one? Two, why would he not want to be a part of the Liberian society? And I say that to say, or to be more specific, why would he not want to live, if you will, as you said, amongst the people? Because Liberia brought people from Sierra Leone, which is some of where President King's family came, as well as Nigeria, where President King brought my mother's family from Virginia, J.J. Roberts. They brought people from the Congo. Liberia was a mecca, a place where the people from the Caribbean, Barbados, came and settled and were part of the society. Why would he not want to do that?
That's a very good question. He didn't want to do that. First, he had difficulty getting passport even to the Caribbean. I mean, when he was in the Caribbean, he had trouble getting back to the United States. And when he was in the United States, he had trouble getting permission to go to Martinique. So he was always with these problems of being a troublemaker. The other reason was that he accused President King of being a slave trader, of being a criminal, who betrayed 1 million indigenous Liberians. In the 19th century, 1,500 people from Sierra Leone, Barbados, et cetera, migrated. But the vast majority of the people couldn't vote. They had to pay taxes. And so President King, bless his heart, because I can remember his dates so easily. President King was president from 1920 to 1930.
Yes.
And the League of Nations sent an investigative team 3 people. And they went all over the country and collected evidence of women raped, babies bayoneted, forced labor, labor going to Fernando Po, which is an island I study, Spanish colony, and someone making money out of it.
Mm-hmm.
He was forced to retire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he was forced, he tried for another term, but he was over. So there was my book started, that's why it's called Black Zion, Black Slavery, because this created in the diaspora this problem. Racists said, you mean you have a colony founded by the descendants of slaves, and this is modern times? This is 1929, and there's slavery? And they made a big thing about it. Well, not everyone was engaged in the slave trade. And the slave trade was not officially a slave trade. What it was contract labor, right? So
Practiced throughout the West Africa. Mm-hmm.
Right. And so you had contract labor, and they were selling it to the French, providing it. But of course, you had people who were literate, who put that X on a piece of paper, and you say, okay, you go for 2 years. Some people came back 3, 4, 5 years. So the League of Nations investigated, and in 1928, I should open the book. I think I'm on the page, but it's better than me talking. Garvey went to Geneva, and he said, I have been betrayed. The indigenous people, the native people of Africa have been betrayed by that man, C.D.B. King. And he says this to the League of Nations. Most people in Liberia didn't vote. And they had no representation. They were called natives. There was one law with the capital C for civilized people, later called Cree, as you know, and then one law for natives, traditional law. And Garvey wanted somehow to break, he never figured out. He sort of said, well, when we come, like the letter from Garcia, the Haitian, when we come, we have to break through these divisions. Now, how he was going to do that, he never figured out because he never went. What would have happened had he gone and his people said, no, we need farms, we need land, we have to eat, we're starving. That land would have come from indigenous people, right? And so he never really worked out how his followers were going to live in Africa without labor and without land. It was sort of a kind of Zionist problem. You had this place, it had people, the people already had their lives established. How were you going to live among them? And his whole thing is, we'll work it out. But it didn't work out. Liberia was accused of slave trading, and then Liberia almost disappeared from the map. But President King's successor, President Barclay, you heard of him?
Of course.
Barclay outwitted the white man. Barclay was one of the stickiest, most clever men I have ever read about, because the League of Nations came in with a plan, and Barclay said, I think it's interesting. Then the United States came in, which wasn't in the League, and said, we have a plan. He says, well, and he compared the two, and for 3 years he played them off. You know what? At the end, both said, we'll leave you alone. Barclay served his term. He wasn't stupid, and there was this whole thing about letters from Firestone. These Africans are stupid. By 1937, they're saying, these Liberian politicians, however bad they are, they're pretty smart. They survived. They were survivors.
Thank you, Professor, for that point. I just wanted to make a...
I've been waiting
yes,
to meet
sir.
you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Just one point in regard to the Christie report, which I have read, which is, I think, I love the discussion, especially now about Garvey, about the land for Black people or the land for peoples, right? Whomever they are. But in terms of President King, in the Christie report, he was never charged. And you can say whichever way. I think Liberia was geopolitically at that time, was, as you mentioned earlier, in the middle of strong colonial powers. And for whatever reason, Garvey, sorry the term, pissed off the Americans. There was something else going on that they felt he was very powerful and that he needed to be stopped. And Liberia, being the only independent nation at that time in West Africa, in all of Africa, besides Ethiopia, of course. of course, besides Ethiopia, had to do a lot. And I know in your book you discuss how people thought about King. But the point is this search for a homeland for Black peoples or peoples in the in as it relates to the Jewish population and all other groups right now. How does that relate today for us? Sometimes I look, I'm born in America, but I identify as an African. I've lived all over the world. Sometimes I look at African Americans and I say, I just wish they had left. Literally, this is how I feel. Of course, this is romantic thinking, perhaps, but these are some of the feelings of the heart. And I just wonder, going back to what Napoleon was saying, as it relates to today, in regards to Black Lives Matter or wherever we are, what's going to happen to any group? It's not just Black peoples, it's many groups that are dispersed.
That's a great question. And there's a thing now, and I'm not part of it, called Afro-pessimism. Even the woman, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who came up with the 1619 Project, says she's a pessimist about where the US is going. Because it's been years, and we still have a horrendous problem, right? I mean, it's been 100 years. So African Americans now have no place really to migrate. Individuals can migrate, but en masse, there's no place to go. So, but we still have this society which is dedicated to, and I read a new book by Isabel Wilkerson on caste. I advise you to read it. Oprah recommends it, and I still like it. Okay, so African Americans are this caste, and what will have to happen if the country is ever to get healthy is to sort of have African Americans, and this is very controversial, be as other immigrant groups have eventually become. Because if African Americans are this sort of outcast group, no matter whether they become presidents or university presidents or they go to the moon, it will still be a stigmatized group with lesser income and residentially segregated and endogamous. And that has certain consequences. So I'm going to tell you something shocking, okay? Now Americans get nervous. Don't be nervous. In 1914, President Theodore Roosevelt visited Brazil, and he said the most radical thing that any American president has ever said about race. And he put it as a quote. When you read the article, it's got quotes at the beginning, quotes at the end. So you think it's actually, he says, I spoke to a Brazilian statesman who was white. And then the rest of the article is saying, in Brazil, and this is not true, but in Brazil, not completely, they treat the Black man according to his merits. And according to his merits, he's accepted into the general society at all levels and all possibilities, including amalgamation, which means intermarriage. And that basically, in 100 years, we will have a kind of, we will have a society in the tropics. Whereas you excluding these people for 100 years are going to end up with 30-something million discontented people who may eventually pull down your republic. Now that is so un-American. And it was in a Republican newspaper called The Outlook that the editors published a disclaimer that the views of former President Roosevelt represent this. Because Americans, this is very nervous stuff. He just said, if you treat everyone the same, exactly the same, and you get rid of residential segregation, you get rid of hyper descent, which at that point, the one drop rule, and in 100 years, you'll be a healthier society. If you don't do it, you will have 30 million people permanently disenfranchised. And at that point, you wait a century, this was 1914, but what the article ends up saying, at that point, it will be too late. I know that's not hopeful, right? Because you're saying, if you continue to have Jim Crow and segregation and mob violence against Black folk, Then in 100 years, when you turn around and say, oops, mistake, let's be nice. Let's elect one. It's gonna be too late. I'm not saying it's too late. I hope it's not. But certainly, I think in the future, African Americans have to stop. African American income is so much less than African American accumulated wealth is so much less than white accumulated wealth.
Mm-hmm.
It has to stop. And I'm on a panel, the panel that I messed up about, all the technology, is at the end of the month on reparations. I have made up my mind. I have some very funny ideas about it, which I will bore you with at a future date. So anyway, you reap what you sow. And so the country's excluded people. And now those excluded people, some of them say, we don't want to be part of you anyway. You're messed up. We don't participate we don't have the same heroes as you do. You've always been racist from the get. The whole country is corrupt, as Nicole Hannah-Jones said last in New York Times, lies and hypocrisy. She actually said that, lies and hypocrisy. The whole, Jefferson and all those people, all they were speaking is lies and hypocrisy. The whole thing is a fraud from the beginning. I don't agree, and I think it's very bad history. Obama doesn't agree. But this, sold thousands of copies. And it's now there's a thing called Afro-pessimism, which says things will never, it sells books. Things are never going to get better. As an older person, and a person who's lived through lots of change, I actually believe that things will, and this is not just a hope, when I was born, things were much worse, but that we have to really push, and push even harder for a just society. And also a society in which, this is an old-fashioned idea, that African Americans participate in society just as anyone else would, if they want to. If they want to. And
Well, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Sundiata, for this informative and engaging presentation. To our audience, as you know, Brandeis is one of the oldest Black Studies department in the country. And our goal here is to establish an endowed chair in the AAAS department. As you all know, this is not the end, but only the beginning of our engaging with professors in the field. Our next session is titled, Why Are Black Folks Still Complaining? That will be held on Wednesday, September 16th at 6 p.m. Again, feel free to engage with Professor Sundiata. We will email in our follow-up email his contact information to engage and ask further questions regarding care. And again, feel free to, if you have any further questions, feel free to email us and engage with us on Facebook as we continue to create programming that you would like to see. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.